All right, good morning. Welcome. That was a great response. Wow, welcome back to week 11 of our trip through Revelation, our comparative study of Revelation. This takes us to, at the end of this week, we should be just about at the one-third mark of the book. 21 chapters, this will be the end of chapter 7. 3 cycles of 7 events each, right? That's all going to kind of tie together at the end of chapter 7 where we are, so that's great. And at this pace, we should be right on track to be done by the end of September. So that's a little concerning maybe, but be that as it may, we have our subject for today. Last week, we looked briefly through the end of chapter 7, but we kind of skimmed over some things, and I said, that is a problem for future Brian to solve, to talk about. We're not going to mess with it this morning. Well, today is future Brian's problem. We now need to address the bits that we jumped over then, this mysterious appearance of this group that's often called the 144,000. So to that end, let's return to the text of Revelation chapter 7. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who'd been given the power to harm earth and sea, saying, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. 12,000 from the tribe of Judah were sealed, 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 from the tribe of Gad, 12,000 from the tribe of Asher, 12,000 from the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 from the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 from the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 from the tribe of Levi, 12,000 from the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 from the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 from the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 from the tribe of Benjamin were sealed. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne, and they worshipped God, saying, "Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever." Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come?" And I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Okay, so there's a lot happening in chapter 7, but our central question is a straightforward one. There is a group identified here, the 144,000 sealed of the 12 tribes of Israel. Who is this group? What are we to make of them? We begin by noting the significance of the number itself. 144,000 is obviously a perfect square times a perfect cube, right? 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. This is not the only place in the book of Revelation that we are going to see significant numerology around 12. We've in fact already seen it, right? We saw earlier in the book, in chapter 4, this group of the 24 elders. And we weren't quite sure what to do with them, but we looked at that number 12 and said, well, 12 here pretty clearly seems to be, among other things, seems to be a reference to 12 plus 12, right? That's where this 24, maybe that's the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel. Maybe it's the 24 courses of the priesthood that are laid out. but there seems to be in view an echoing, obviously, of 12 in that numbering. Well, here we have not 12 plus 12, but 12 times 12. We'll see this kind of numbering again as the book goes forward. When we come to the New Jerusalem very late in the book, we will again see an echoing of measurements that are 12 plus 12 and 12 times 12. And so there's this sense in John, in John's writings here, of this tying to the covenants of these numbers, right? That 12s often seem to be either a call back to the old covenant or a call to the new, or to both. What we have here then is followed by this tribal list, right? John not only tells us there are 144,000 people here, but he tells us that they are taken from the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he gives us a list of 12 tribes with 12,000 people sealed from each of them. Does anybody notice anything interesting about the list of the 12 tribes that John gives us? If you don't have your Bible open for that, let me flip back a slide or two. So there's our list of 12 tribes. Are there any peculiarities about the 12 tribes of Israel that you see numbered off there? There's several good answers here.
Well, under Joseph, don't they do half tribes instead?
Yes, good. Joseph is not a tribe of Israel, right? Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Those are two tribes, or two half-tribes, depending where you are in the Old Testament. And there's various ways the tribes are numbered off at various points in the Old Testament. But Joseph doesn't get a tribe to himself. There should be a tribe of Ephraim and a tribe of Manasseh. Hey, look, there's the tribe of Manasseh. So we have one of Joseph's kids gets a tribe, and Joseph gets a tribe. How does that work? Right? What's going on there? Good. There's an oddity. Speaking of which, that ought to prompt us to see another oddity here. Yeah, where's Ephraim? He's not in the list. Can anybody spot who else is missing? This is a test of how well you know your tribes of Israel here. I would not pass this test. I'm cheating. I already know the answer.
I can't remember Dan.
That's it. Dan's missing. Yeah, the tribe of Dan is not present here. There's one other oddity that's maybe not as pronounced as those others, and that's, where do we start here? Judah, right. Where would we naturally expect to start? Reuben, right, the firstborn. And so it is a little peculiar that our listing of the tribes begins with Judah. Now, we've already met a figure earlier in the book of Revelation, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? Judah is the kingly line. There's various reasons that Judah might be promoted here. If you remember the story of Reuben and some of the things that he gets up to, there's reasons Reuben might get kicked down a notch or two in the listing as well, right? But it is an odd listing to put Judah out of sequence here at the beginning. So there's several strange things about this. If we read this very straightforwardly as a list of the 12 tribes of Israel, this is not exactly a list that we would expect, right? It does not exactly align with the kind of numbering we might think, the kind of listing we might think from our encounters of the tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. I'm going to come back forward a bit here. Again, this doubling up on Joseph with Manasseh, the missing of Ephraim, the missing Dan. So this oddity leads to or contributes to two main views of what's happening here, how we understand what's in view here. The premillennial view is primarily going to read this, as usual, try to read it in a mostly literal fashion and say, the 12 tribes of Israel with the 12,000 numbered off from each of them are, follow me on this one, they're actually 12,000 people numbered off from each of these 12 tribes of Israel, right? It is a literal counting of a literal 144,000 people of Israelite descent, right? That this cluster of, we would say Jewish Christians, except they're not all Jewish because they're not all from Judah, right? This cluster of Israelite Christians is picked out in this time of tribulation and are sealed. They are given this promise of preservation, right? We notice this sequence of events that plays out. all these angels, these four angels, are ready to come in and to strike the land and the sea and the growing grass and the trees, and they are held back for a moment so that these people can be sealed, can be given this mark of protection, right? We talked last week about how this is a callback to the way the high priest in the Old Testament is marked, that the high priest bears on his forehead a sign that says, "Holy to the Lord," and that now it is not just one man who's being marked in this way, it is a vast number who are being called out and marked out and given this promise of protection or preservation in the troubles that are about to come, right? And so that's the premillennial view here. It's also the dispensationalist view. This is a select group that are marked out and protected against some of the particular troubles that are on their way. The amillennial or postmillennial view, on the other hand, would primarily see this group as the church. Now, there's some variations within that. The amillennials are going to say this is definitely the church. The postmillennials might say it's the church. They might associate this, well, you remember the focus of postmillennialism, right? It's all about, Revelation is about those events in AD 70 with the fall of Jerusalem. They might say this has to do with a group that's being preserved from the destruction of Jerusalem. Those who are, in Christ's words, fleeing to the mountains, right? Those who are fleeing what's about to come and they escape from Jerusalem before the destruction falls on it. And so a postmillennial might read it either way there. I think the more common reading is still that this is the church, that this is ultimately the church in view. Why the church? Well, again, if you're going to say there are oddities in this list reading it literally, right? If it's strange as to which tribes are called out, we might look at that then and say, okay, well, it's not meant to be read literally. John's readers recognize it as such. Okay? Let's look at some arguments for both of these perspectives. Before I push on to that, does anybody have a question? Anything where we stand so far? Everybody good? Yes?
It just seems that there's an awful lot of detail in if it's completely allegorical or, symbolic. Why be so almost redundant in 12,000 from this one, 12,000 from that one, and et cetera, right?
Okay, good. So
Summarize.
why all of the detail? Why all of the specificity if this is meant to be read non-literally? And I think that's one of the common premillennial critiques here, is to say John doesn't just say 144,000 from the tribes of Israel. He wants you to know exactly who he's talking about. He gives this kind of peculiar association of all of them, right? What is the point of that, if not to try to say, well, I'm telling you all this specific detail because the specific detail is relevant, is what's actually taking place here, right? That would be a common premillennial critique here, is to say the detail is evidence of literal fulfillment. Angela?
I don't know, does this mean that Israel, if you take it in a sense, it can mean anything, but does this mean that Israel still has to enter through the old way instead of through the blood of Christ?
Great question. Is this an evidence of the Israelites still having to come through the old ways of the old covenant and not through the blood of Christ? And I think virtually everybody in this space would answer that question no. Even if you're in the dispensationalist space here, I think you're going to say, look, no, there's one name given under heaven to men by which they must be saved. Everybody who comes through the blood of Christ. Some variants of dispensationalism will argue that there is something like a literal temple rebuilt in Israel during this time, right? There's a literal physical temple, that there may be an offering system in place here, but most of those are still going to say, but this 144,000, this is not just Israel generically, this is specifically chosen of Israel who have come to Christ, who are saved through the blood of the Lamb, right? And we see that, I think, in some of the song that goes up from them, right? So if we look at the praise associated here, the song that immediately echoes, now it's not just the 144,000 here, maybe, hold that thought, let's come back for it, but the song is very clearly to the one who sits on the throne and to the Lamb, right? Christ is very clearly in view in the praise that we're seeing immediately after this. There's a later chapter, I think it's 20, where we are told that the 144,000 learn a song of praise to the Lamb that only they can sing, right? And so I think there's a strong evidence here to say this is not a return to Judaism. That has huge problems with Paul's argument in Galatians and lots of other problems, right? This is not a return to salvation through a system of sacrifices, and there's no going back to that. But that it is the dispensationalist view would say this is an explicitly Israelite promise that's being made here. Is that answering you? Yeah, good. Anybody else there?
Then are we to believe that like those 12,000 were maybe Jews that had been saved or something? That's the reason those 12,000 were selected from the tribes?
Yes, so what the argument would be is that these 12,000 from each tribe are at least some portion of Israel that has, in the last days, has come to Christ and has had faith in him. Maybe it's exactly 12,000 Israelites from each tribe come to Christ. Maybe it's of those who come, 12,000 are marked. Maybe the 12,000 part is symbolic, but the from the tribes part is not, right? Is it an exact numbering off? I don't know that we have to argue that it is, right? I mean, we can think of God's promises to Elijah, right? Where Elijah says to him, I'm the only one left. And God replies, no, I've reserved to myself, and I'll confess I can't remember the number off the top of my head. Does anybody? How many? No, all right. I've reserved to myself, and he says, all these many who have not bent the knee to Baal. Most of us would not look at that passage, I think, and be like, all right, well, God means exactly that quantity, right? Exactly that many souls have not bent the knee to Baal, and everybody else has. And, if one more child is born, he's got to make sure he keeps the numbers balanced there, right? That it's an approximation. Maybe it's something like that the 12 is a significant number, but it's not meant to be exactly 12,000 from each tribe. Does that kind of make sense? But yes, Jewish Christians would be the first view. Jewish Christians coming through the tribulation here in this end time, but numbered off at least in approximations, if not in exact numbers from these various tribes. Now there's another problem with numbering off 12,000 people from each tribe, right? What's a basic problem with counting off 12,000 people from each of the tribes of Israel, or from almost each of the tribes of Israel?
We only know for sure of Judah and Benjamin.
Yes, good.
All the rest are where did they go?
So if you remember your Old Testament history here, I'm going to come back forward again. If you remember your Old Testament history, you know that Israel splits into two tribes in the midst of the Old Testament, right? Into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, right? Judah gets Judah and Benjamin, who do not get to have part of the name of the southern kingdom. And Israel gets basically all the rest. They get the other 10 tribes. Well, if you remember that your journey through the books of Kings and Chronicles, right? All the kings of Israel are terrible. Most of the kings of Judah are terrible. Eventually, God judges Israel by sending in the Assyrians, and all the 10 tribes of Israel are carried off into captivity. Some years later, the southern 2 tribes are captured by Babylon. They too are carried off, right? But the Babylonians, the Persians, eventually send everybody back, right? They eventually send back tribes to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The Jews, right, what we today call the Jews, are in large part the descendants of Judah, right? There's the name. The Jews go back and they rebuild Jerusalem in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Assyria never sends anybody back, right? Assyria does not return the 10 northern tribes. And so today, it's kind of hard to find the 10 northern tribes of Israel. What do we do with that?
Weren't there certain faithful individuals and parts of the priesthood that left the northern kingdom and migrated south because they ideologically and religiously believed
Good.
this is the true kingdom?
So let me press, that's exactly right. Aren't there some who come south and go into the kingdom there? Exactly right. Let me press forward a little bit and we'll see some of that event take place here. So let's look first at the argument that this is indeed the literal tribes of Israel. First, we might ask the question, why are Dan and Ephraim left off of this list? And there are various rationales that have been given here. Some have argued that there is evidence in the book of Revelation that the Antichrist comes specifically from the line of Dan. I'm not 100% sold on that. Some people have tried to make that case. Others have pointed to this and have said that there are specific passages in the Old Testament that call out Dan and Ephraim specifically as idolatrous. So for instance, in Hosea 5 has this long section that is just about how awful Ephraim is, right? He just goes on against Ephraim specifically, you big bunch of jerks, right? And the idea is Ephraim has apostated. They have left the faith of Yahweh behind, and they have followed idols entirely. And so the argument is, as judgment on Dan and Ephraim for these strayings that are described in the Old Testament, the judgment will be that they are now cut off. They do not get a part in this final preservation. Now that might be right. Let me just add a note of critique back onto the end of it, and that is, if you want to pick a tribe of Israel and find pretty strong condemnation of it said at some point in the Old Testament, you will probably succeed at that task, right? Can we find things that Dan and Ephraim are doing and go, yeah, God would be totally justified in cutting them off? Yes. Can you do that for the other 10 tribes? Yes. That's kind of the point, right? Everyone stands condemned, right? We could look at Benjamin. Think about all the awful things that Benjamin gets up to late in the book of Judges, right? The rest of Israel turns on Benjamin as a tribe and massacres them because of the evil that is being committed there, to where Benjamin is almost wiped out as a tribe. If Benjamin was missing from this list, we could very easily point to those passages and say, aha, that's why Benjamin is missing here, right? And I think no matter which tribes were off the list, we could probably build a construction something like that. And so that makes me a little skeptical here. Now, I am myself going to make an argument of this form in just a minute that I think is interesting, but I don't think any of the interesting arguments add up to a certainty on this. Does that make sense? Scott?
And also, we need to keep in mind that just as Judah is often used to mean the entire southern kingdom, frequently Ephraim is used to stand in for the entire northern kingdom in these Old Testament prophecies.
Yeah, so is this a critique of Ephraim specifically, or of the whole north that's in view here? And if it's the whole north, well then why are all the other northern tribes, except for Dan, then told, but you get numbered in the list here, right? Good. Anybody else?
Does the tribe of Dan ever repent, and that's why they're not on the list?
I don't think we get, Israel is in the throes of idolatry when they are dragged off by Assyria, right? And that is kind of the last word we have on them is, your idolatry has gone beyond all bounds, right? There's no more mercy here. Off you go into captivity. Okay, so the question we had a moment ago is literal fulfillment even possible? Could this be literally fulfilled? What do we do with the loss of the 10 northern tribes? And as we had noted a moment ago, not everybody who's in the 10 northern tribes gets deported, right? I think it's too easy to think of this as kind of a modern military operation where you've got like checkpoints on all the borders, and right, you can, today it's easier to round up a big group of people, but like this is a big area, right? There are all sorts of refugees able to flee south across the border into Judah as the northern kingdom begins to collapse. And we know that this happens. In 2 Chronicles chapter 30, we have this section, and I didn't have room on the page to fit it in, but if you flip to that chapter, you'll see Hezekiah sends out this message. So Hezekiah, of course, king of Judah, right? Hezekiah, the good king of Judah, sends out a message to all Israel and Judah, and also to Ephraim and Manasseh, right? Writing across the river Jordan to let everybody know that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. And one of the things it says there in this passage is that they have to delay the celebration of the Passover because there are not enough consecrated priests to perform it. why are there not enough consecrated priests to perform it at the normal time? Well, it doesn't explicitly say, right? There's no clear answer given, but a plausible answer to that is that the population, and there's some archaeological evidence to support some of this as well, a plausible answer to that is that the population of Judah is booming as everybody flees into Judah, right? That there's just not enough people available, there's not enough priests available to deal with the sudden surge in population. Hezekiah now puts out this call to everybody who hasn't come, and he says, look, come down here, celebrate the Passover with us in Jerusalem, come out of Israel as it collapses, and come to Jerusalem. And so we're told couriers go through all the country of Israel, through Ephraim and Manasseh, as far as Zebulun. We're told they go from Beersheba to Dan. Now, if you look at a map of the northern kingdom of Israel, Dan is at the far northern tip, Beersheba is the far southern tip. And so this is from sea to shining sea, right? From one end of the country to the other, they go spreading this message. What happens? Well, the messengers go through, but the people of Israel laugh at them to scorn and mock them. However, some men of Asher, Manasseh, and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. And so we have an explicit moving of some of the tribes that are visited coming down into Jerusalem, into Judah, and presumably remaining there. Who doesn't come? Of the tribes specifically mentioned in this passage, who is not mentioned as coming south? Dan and Ephraim. That's interesting, isn't it? All right, so many of the members of the tribe of Israel move into the region of Judah. They effectively merge into the tribe of Judah, right? So what we today think of as the Jewish people contains many descendants of the other 10 tribes. That's a possible solution to this, is that this is within Israel itself, within the Jews themselves, that this is satisfied. How else might it be satisfied? Well, we know that some of the people in Israel are left in Israel, right? Some of the northern 10 tribes are left in Israel. Not all of them are deported. It's just that when they're left there, the Syrians also bring in pagan peoples from the neighboring kingdoms, and they resettle those people into Israel, right? And so the Israelites who are left there and the pagan nations that are brought in, they intermarry, and the descendants of this intermarriage are the Samaritans, right? Where in the New Testament we find this boundless contempt of the Jews for the Samaritans, because the Samaritans have not kept the bloodline pure, right? They have not stayed within the nation of Israel. They've intermarried with these foreign peoples. They're doing their own worship up there in the north, right? And so there's this contempt for the Samaritans as not really properly being of Israel anymore. Nonetheless, the Samaritans are, at least in part, descended of the remnants of the 10 northern tribes. There remain today some Samaritans. There are about 1,000 people living in modern Israel who still self-label as the tribal unit of Samaria, of the Samaritans. They are a declining number, right? This is not a growing population, but there are still some Samaritans that are in some part descended from the original 10 tribes that would live there today. There are also various groups around the world that claim descent from the 10 tribes after they are deported. So there are various groups that say, the tribe of such and such was brought here, and we migrated this way after Assyria fell, and we are the descendants of some of these 10 tribes that were sent out into the world. This is a member of what's called the Lemba people. Right? Visually, the Lemba they're African, right? But the Lemba have, for generations, claimed descent from the Jewish diaspora. They have said, we are of the line of Israel. We've just been sent down into mid-southern Africa. We've migrated down to here over the centuries after we were deported by Assyria. Now that's a claim. Claims can be true or false. In the last 20 or 30 years, with genetic sequencing, we've been able to analyze the Y chromosomes of the Lemba people. Now, genetically, if you're male, your Y chromosome is the same as your father's Y chromosome, right? You have to inherit your father's Y chromosome. He inherited his father's Y chromosome and so on back. And so an easy way to track patrilineal descent, father to father to father, is to look at those Y chromosomes and you can see the family lines reaching back. Does that make sense? Everybody follow me on that? You can follow that back and say, well, whose Y chromosome was this originally? We've genetically sequenced the lemba, and the lemba carry the Semitic Y chromosome, right? So Semitic, right, meaning Semite, so Jews and Arabs both carry the Semitic Y chromosome. That is not a proof of the truth of the lemba's claims. They might be descended from Arabs rather than Jews, for instance. But it indicates there is a much closer familial connection that at least fits with their self-description of where they came from, that they might be right. The Jewish faith has actually recognized the lemba as part of the lost tribes. They have been officially declared to be one of the lost tribes of Israel, or the descent of one of the lost tribes of Israel. And so they at least recognize this claim. Is it 100% true? I can't tell you that, right? But there is at least plausibility to it from the evidence we have in hand. Are you with me? There are various other groups that have similar claims, some of which have more or less evidence to support them. But if you want to say, where are the 10 tribes, there's another possible answer. Another argument for why this should be fulfilled literally is that we find in here perhaps a fulfillment of some of the Old Testament promises to Israel. Right? So in Ezekiel 39, Ezekiel has this long statement from God where he promises to give a fulfillment, right? Promises to bring the Israelites back to their nation, right? To pull them back to their land and to be their God once again. Ezekiel accompanies this with a specific list of where the 12 tribes will be settled. However, it's not the same 12 tribes as the 12 tribes that John lists, which is a problem, right? Maybe it's that. Maybe this is a fulfillment of what Paul says in Romans 11, right? Paul has this great promise in Romans 11 where he's trying to explain Israel's lack of faith, right? He's had this discussion for several chapters now. Why doesn't Israel believe? Why haven't they received their Messiah? And he says, look, you Gentiles, ultimately, this is there to make, you are here to make Israel jealous, right? God has brought you in so that Israel can be made jealous. He has grafted you in as these unnatural branches to the olive tree of salvation, while Israel has been cut off from the tree of which they are naturally a part. Well, if they've been cut off, they can be grafted in again. And he says, in the end, all Israel will be saved. A partial hardening has come on Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Perhaps we find in Revelation 7 the final satisfaction of that irrevocable gift, where all Israel is saved, all Israel is called to return. I think, again, and this is one of the ones that really strikes me, I think, again, one of the best arguments for literality is the contrast between the description of the 144,000 and what comes next. Because in the very next verse of chapter 7, we read that John looks, right after he's seen this numbering of the 144,000 to be sealed, right? He looks and he says, behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God. The elder asks him who this is. John dodges the question, and the elder says, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now look, folks, who is it that's washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb, coming out of every tribe and nation and tongue? Who is that? That's the church, right? That's us. Now, maybe, depending on your view, maybe this is a specific part of the church. Some have argued from the fact that John says these are those who've come out of the Great Tribulation, right? Remember that some take the phrase the Great Tribulation to refer specifically to this 7-year period or part of the 7-year period in the events of Revelation, right? And so if you're going to hold to a view of the rapture, especially of an early rapture, you might say these are those who have come out of the Great Tribulation, right? Those raptured from the Great Tribulation. Otherwise, you might look at this and say, I think this is the whole church. I think they are like John. If John can say of himself, I am your partner in the tribulation, then these are those from John's day to the present, right? To this fulfillment, all the church of all nations called up here. But either way, nobody looks at this part and says, well, this is still just the people of Israel, right? But there's an odd contrast here. John moves from, here are 144,000 of these specific tribes of this specific nation, to a group that no one can number of all tribes and nations. Now, if the church is the second thing, it's hard for the church to also be the first thing. Does that make sense? I think this is one of the strongest arguments for the literality of the 144,000 is that divide. Okay. What about the other side of it then? Could the 144,000 be the church? In this case, the promise that is made here is a promise that would be a direct word of comfort to John's listeners. Remember who John is writing to, right? He's writing to a church that is suffering persecution, that in some cases have resisted even unto death, where the promises he has to them are not necessarily of deliverance, but promises that Christ will be with them, that Christ is the Lamb who conquers by his death. So too you conquer in yours, right? And John makes this promise in this view to the church and says, even in the midst of all your troubles, even in the midst of the suffering you will undergo, Christ will preserve you, right? You will be ultimately preserved from a heavenly perspective, right? From an earthly perspective, all sorts of things might happen to you. But from a heavenly perspective, your preservation is guaranteed. This then is a direct word of comfort to John's listeners, who are not primarily Jewish, right? And ties in with his theme throughout the book, again, in this perspective. In this reading, particularly in a preterist reading, right? Remember that the preterist reading of Revelation is in large part, remember that scroll with the 7 seals on it that waits to be opened? The preterist understanding of that is a scroll of judgment against Israel, right? That this is God is fed up with the crimes of Israel, with their persecution of the church. God now comes in judgment to them. Some have even argued that it is the scroll of God's divorce, that he is separating himself finally from the nation of Israel altogether because of their rejection of the Messiah. And so why, in this view, would we then have a group called out that is actual literal Israel if the whole theme here is God is coming in judgment on Jerusalem? You see it? Again, there's this idea that the book is written to Christians who are suffering persecution. Remember his letters to in chapters 2 and 3, right? He writes and says, I know that you are suffering under the hands of those who claim they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan, right? In that perspective, if that is if that is John's writing on the Jews of these days, they're a synagogue of Satan because they have turned to persecution of the church, then again, this is a promise in that view of comfort to Christians against their Jewish persecutors. Another argument against the literality here that a preterist would say is to say, look, there is no group matching this description that we can find today, right? We don't have the 12 tribes. We don't have people to take 12,000 from each of them.
Brian,
Yes, Alan.
to that point, I was just sitting there thinking about that. While the Jews might not know what tribe they're from, God knows what tribe they're from.
Yep, and that is...
So God could find the 144,000 throughout the world. They might be scattered throughout the world, but he knows what tribe they're all from.
And that's basically the argument I want to make in the for side, right? Is to say even, I don't know if the Lemba are genuinely descendants of Israel or not, but God certainly does, right? There may not be distinct people groups that are descended from, these Jewish refugees in Assyria. That does not mean there are no people descended from the Jewish refugees in Assyria. Humanly, we might not be able to pick out the 144,000. That doesn't mean there's not a fulfillment possible here. But I don't think the preterist view needs just, we can't find them as a critique here. There are a couple others that I think do have some strength here. We've already pointed to some of them. One of those being that when we get tribal lists elsewhere in the Old Testament associated with promises of God's preservation of them, it is not the 12 tribes that are numbered off here. Right? John does not hit the 12 tribes given to us in Ezekiel, for instance. There are also some oddities. Like, look here. Here's later in Revelation, chapter 21. Here's the New Jerusalem come down. We are told that on the gates of the New Jerusalem are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel, and that it had 12 foundations on which were the names of the 12 apostles. Well, again here, regardless of whether this vision is literal or not, certainly the naming here is a callback of the Old Testament and the New, the Old Covenant and the New, right? There's a linking here in the description that's made. Likewise, the city has, it's measured 12,000 stadia long. Its wall is 144 cubits high. It's 12 times 12 cubits high, right? And so the argument here would be to say this numerology is meant to imply a completeness, a gathering together of all God's promises into a final fulfillment. And it's that 12 numbering, that callback to the old and new that John is emphasizing here, that the church is the fulfillment of all the old prophecies to Israel gathered together, the old covenant finding its final fulfillment here. That would be basically the argument. You might also note that this is not the only place in Revelation where John says, okay, I'm going to see one thing, and then he sees something radically different. Right? A few verses before, he gets told he should keep an eye out for a lion. What does he see? He sees a lamb, right? Look, here's the lion. And I beheld a lamb standing as if slain. Is this the same thing? Look, John, here are the 144,000. And I looked, and behold, a multitude that no one could number. Is this a deliberate shift to say what in one sense is 144,000, a fulfillment of these prophecies of old, right, of Israel in particular, but then when I looked at that group, I didn't see 144,000. I saw the church in all its numbers spread out before me, and I saw them as the fulfillment. Is that the idea that there is a shift in his understanding in the prophecy here? In particular, this view would argue that the prophecies made to Israel in the Old Testament find their fulfillment in the church. Right? So consider Paul. Paul's in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 here, right? Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, says, "We are the temple of the living God. As it is said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Now pause there for a moment. That's a quote from several parts of the Old Testament. One of those parts is Ezekiel 37. We were just in Ezekiel right around chapter 37, reading these promises where God says, I will call the 12 tribes back together. Can somebody pull for me Ezekiel 37? Can I get somebody to grab that chapter for me? Could you get me starting in verse 21, and I'll stop you in a minute here.
And say to them, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone, and will gather them from all around, and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. And one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations, and no longer divided into two kingdoms. They shall not defile themselves any more with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions. All
right, pause there for me. I'm going to have you keep going in just a second. Think about what so that's Ezekiel 37, right? Starting in verse 21. Look at how specific that promise is to being about the particular nation of Israel. They will be called back together from all the lands. They will no longer be two kingdoms, but they will be one. They will give up their idolatry. This is extremely grounded in the particularities of the people of Israel of that time, right? Okay, keep going for me.
But I will save them from all their backslidings in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David my servant shall be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And the nation.
Okay, good. Let's stop there. Right? Did you catch that last bit? Different translations, but it's the same phrasing. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. We have this extremely specific promise to Israel, and Paul turns around to the church in Corinth and he says, we are the temple of the living God because this promise is fulfilled in us. Right? He absorbs the promise of Israel into the new covenant to be given to the church. Again, in Ephesians chapter 2, speaking to the church in Ephesus, remember you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and the strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. So you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the apostles of the Lamb, and there were 12 gates, and on the gates were the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. Boy, doesn't that sound like being built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. So, if these promises to Israel are absorbed into the church, perhaps that is what John echoes as well, to say they find their fulfillment in the expansion of God's covenant from a single people to all peoples. One more challenge here. Later in the book of Revelation, we find various guarantees that are twofold. First, that the 144,000 are protected against various things that happen. And second, that they remain faithful in the midst of those things. Look, for instance, ahead to Revelation chapter 9. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft there rose like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. The rest of mankind, that is, not those not described here, who were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of their works of their hands, nor give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone. There are only two groups described in Revelation 9. Those sealed who are not harmed, and those who do not give up worshiping idols. If the 144,000 are not the church, where is the church here? I said earlier, I think the contrast between the 144,000 and the numberless multitude is one of the strongest premillennial arguments. I think this twofold split, where you have on the one hand those sealed and on the other hand idolaters, is one of the strongest arguments against. Right? Again, we come late in the book. In chapter 14, on Mount Zion stands the Lamb, and with him the 144,000. And they sing a new song before the throne and before the living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who'd been redeemed from the earth. Now again, if this is a separate group, where then is the church? where is the numberless multitude in this picture if they are not part of the 144,000?
During the tribulation, you got to figure that there's going to be people that are going to be, accept Christ as their Savior that are not of the original 144,000. Could this be part of that multitude?
Well, I mean, we're told explicitly it is the 144,000 described here, right? If the multitude is a separate group, the multitude could be those saved during the tribulation. It could be those raptured from the tribulation. It could be those saved across all of history, right? Any of those are possible readings of who the multitude is. They're clearly not limited to Israelite Christianity, right? Because by definition, they go beyond a single tribe and nation. Beyond that, we're back in, I don't know, territory, right? Could be any of those. But where are they here, whoever they are? Okay, all right. I have a couple of slides past that question. I don't have an answer for you. I think there's really strong arguments to be made both ways on this, right? I read some chapters of Revelation and go, yeah, obviously that's got to be Israel specifically. I don't see how it could be anything but Israel specifically. And then I hit some of these other passages and go, oh no. Oh, I felt really sure about it a page ago, and now I am struggling to make sense of this, right? Some of these things remain obscure to us. I have a hard time seeing how it moves back and forth here. I think there are good arguments to be made both ways. That is at least a sampling of the way that people would argue in both ways. And so now you get to share in my pain on that. So there we go. Anybody a question, a comment, anything where we stand before moving into some closing notes here?
I'm missing how this fits in with a preterist view.
Okay, so the preterist view, not all of this would fit in the preterist view. Some of it would be more the amillennial, and I've distinguished those badly this morning. The preterist view has two main subcamps. One subcamp sees the 144,000 as being Jews specifically who are delivered out of the fall of Jerusalem in the Roman invasion. The other camp would see this as a description of something like God's preservation of the church, right? Of just the church surviving as these terrible things are happening. The amillennial would extend that more to say, this is the church across all time, right? So it is not Israel specifically, but this is God's promise of preservation of his church beginning in the first century and continuing up through the present. I haven't distinguished those cleanly because the basic break point there is between those who say, is it Israel specifically and is it not? And then depending on how you've answered that question, you kind of then roll it forward into, well, if it's Israel, when is it Israel? Or if it's not Israel, it's got to be every time, right? It's got to be kind of continuing. Does that fairly answer that? You're right. Not all of this would be cleanly preterist, but the preterists would be part of that split in the argument as to who goes where. Is that partial answer? Yeah, good question. Anybody else? Okay, all right. Let's end on a more comforting note there. Whoever the 144,000 are, they are in with this multitude. And the multitude joins in a song, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb, right? They stand in, and I love this imagery, they stand in white robes. How have the robes been made white? They've been washed in blood, right? They have been made white by being dipped in blood and have been made clean and pure and blameless here. And this promise is made, and the promise is made, remember, we are headed into the worst judgments, right? The worst judgments are still ahead for us. And in the midst of promises of, we've just seen famine, we've just seen disease, we've just seen war, we're seeing all the fire that's yet to rain on the earth in the chapters ahead, and we are given this promise, they shall hunger no more, nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. The Lamb will be their shepherd, right? There's all these ironic inversions, right? The robes made white in blood, the Lamb who is the shepherd. And that's the promise given, whoever the 144,000 is. This promise is not given to them alone. This promise is given to all the church, right? These are those who've made themselves clean in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in the temple. And here in the end here, perhaps the words of Psalm 23, right? He will be their shepherd and he will guide them to springs of living water. That's the promise for us. We'll close on that. Next week we got bad news. I'll see you then.